sorry for my English.
It's fine. Sorry for my French, which is worse.
So, vital.
What's called anarchism, I have to be careful about this, what was called anarchism was pretty much an immigrant phenomenon. Actually, there were indigenous developments, sometimes called anarchism, sometimes not, which are similar in many ways. So people don't call the Knights of Labor or the Farmers Alliance anarchism. But these were huge, popular movements which had kind of anarchist strains to them. They never heard of anarchism. If you look at factory workers right around here in New England, where the Industrial Revolution began in the 1840s, 1850s, I mean, they had a labor press, which was a very lively labor press in which working people were participating, artisans, young women from the farms, and so on. And a lot of it was anarchist themes. They never heard of anarchism. Workers should, those who work in the mills should own them. We don't want to, we're being degraded by the force of capitalist oppression. We should be free. We should have our free rights as humans. They're taking away our culture and so on. Very similar to the themes you get in the anarchist writings. There was also a parallel farmers' movement. Remember, it was mostly an agricultural society, but there was a huge spontaneous farmers' movement, actually rooted in Texas. It's hard to believe when you come back, and quite radical populist movement. The farmers were being wiped out by merchants, banks, and they were trying to find ways out of it. And as they tried to work their way out of it, they began to form cooperatives. First marketing cooperatives, later production cooperatives, finally even independent financial institutions to free them from, they didn't call it Wall Street then, from the New England, the Boston bankers and so on, the New England bankers who were strangling them. And they tried to unite, and they had just plain, mostly people without any formal education, just somebody had been to school for 2 years as what they called lecturers, going around most of the country organizing people and so on. It's the largest radical democratic movement. The Industrial Revolution was beginning, and working people were beginning to struggle against the growing business system, later the corporate system. And you see it in the labor press of the kind that I mentioned. There were people bitterly combating what they called the new spirit of the age. Gain wealth, forgetting all but self. That's not the way we live. We live cooperatively. We help each other. We have a high cultural level, which in fact they did, and it's all being destroyed. We're being degraded. And that turned into the Knights. That's one of the streams that led to the Knights of Labor, which was quite a mass organization, hundreds of thousands of people. It was destroyed. They tried to link up into a farmer-labor alliance, became the populist movement among the agrarian population, quite lively labor movement. And I mean, in the 1890s, I mean, in the mining and steel areas like western Pennsylvania, they were running the towns. They had the mayors and so on. And then it was pretty much crushed by force right through this period. Knights of Labor were crushed by Jay Gould, in gang, security forces smashed up the strikes. They were never able to figure out a way of preventing scabs, strikebreakers, and they were used along with National Guard and private security forces just to smash up strikes. There was a substantial Jewish anarchist movement, including people he mentioned, like Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and others. And it was organized. Newspapers, schools, working class organization. Actually, my own father, who came here as an immigrant in 1913, went to work in a sweatshop. He actually joined the IWW. He didn't exactly know what it was, but it just seemed like these guys. He told me once they were for the workers, so he joined them. But and they were what that wasn't Jewish particularly, but there were Jews in it. But by the time I came on the scene in the 1930s, some of the newspapers were still around, like Freie Arbeiterstimme. It was there and it was read, but it was small. I mean, I spent time as a kid in the offices of Freie Arbeiterstimme, just talking to older people and picking up pamphlets and things like that. Of course, there was also a major Italian anarchist movement,
yes,
which was developing the same way. I mean, immigrants coming in, German anarchist movements, and others. And then there were the independent indigenous native forces, like, say, the huge Farmers Alliance, Knights of Labor, labor movement, and so on. And they had various relations, but by the 1920s, it had been pretty much silenced, mostly by force. Actually, there's a very important book on American labor history by David Montgomery, late labor historian. It's called something like The Rise and Fall of the House of Labor, or some name like that. And the fall is the 1920s. The United States has a very violent labor history. There were no way of preventing strike breakers. Troops were brought in if they had to. Homestead, Pennsylvania, which was basically a labor-run town, it was just smashed up by force. When Berkman tried to kill Frick, it was in response to the violence of the Carnegie private security and state security forces that were used just to smash up the labor unions and the activists and murders. I mean, as late as the late 1930s, workers were still being killed in the United States in labor actions. It hadn't happened in Europe for decades.
yes, that's right.
In fact, when even conservative visitors came to the United States, they were appalled by the way labor was treated. The London Times, Australian Unionists, and so on. The Civil War never really ended in the United States, literally. You take a look at the 2012 election, take a look at the electoral maps the day after the election, the red and blue states. It's the Confederacy and the Union, almost exactly. And out of the Civil War came sectional parties. There were two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, but they were each sectional. The motto was, you vote the way you shoot. And the two sectional parties never became class parties. They were both taken over by entrepreneurs and bankers and so on. And that goes right to the present. You don't have class parties. There's no parliamentary labor party. I mean, there's differences between the two parties, but they're both basically business parties. And that goes way back to the Civil War. We've never gotten out of it. Black population being criminalized, sent to prison, becoming a workforce. A lot of the Industrial Revolution came out of that. And race antagonisms were used and exploited to break up working class organization. And the same was true of the immigrants. So, for example, in Boston, right here, you go back to the late 19th century, Irish were regarded as kind of like Negroes. You could have restaurants saying no dogs are Irish and things like that. And there was what were called Huns, meaning almost anybody from southeastern Europe as a Hun. They were hated. And this complex society led to a lot of internal conflict. Bolshevism was the blow. Stalinism turned it into something grotesque. They were a particular kind of orthodox Marxist who held that the revolution will have to be led by the proletariat in the most advanced capitalist country, which for them was Germany. So they were looking forward to a revolution in Germany in the late teens, 1917, 18, and then Russia would become a kind of backwater. Well, there was an uprising in Germany, but it was crushed by force, and that was gone. And after that, they simply moved to a form of basically state capitalism. And yes, there were anarchist armies in Russia itself, like the Makhno army, which were used to drive off the whites, but then destroyed by the Red Army. They didn't want any. They wanted a tight ship that they were going to run. Kronstadt came, and it was the last gasp of any independent left in Russia. There was a kind of a widespread belief that somehow this is a socialist revolution, and now this is going to be the leadership of the world socialist movement. In fact, my view is a very reactionary movement from the beginning, from 1917 and 18. But it's the picture that Emma Goldman and others gave after they were there. But I think it was, I wasn't alive. But looking back, it seemed to be obvious from the very beginning. However, that became the leadership of the left. And as a result, it seriously undermined real popular radical forces. There was an important anarchist revolution in 1936. First of all, a major strands of anarchism, like anarcho-syndicalism, were assumed that they were going to have a highly organized and highly structured society based on voluntary association, on federalism, on the communal structures, cooperatives, all kinds of things. And sometimes it was spelled out in enormous detail. For example, there's a book by I think an Argentine anarchist who was Abad de Santillan, and it must be 1936 or so, which it's called something like After the Revolution, and it's a critique of Spanish anarchism and a description of what it ought to be like. And he gives an extremely detailed picture of what an anarchist society should be like. But that was within the spirit of the anarchist movements. Yes, they intended to have an organized, structured society, organized from below, controlled from below, but not just we say, no, here's what we want. It was crushed mainly by the communists, but they're by force. The communists in Spain were the petty bourgeois, the police, and so on. And Stalin didn't want a popular revolution anywhere. There's an understanding, kind of an intuitive understanding everywhere that we need not submit ourselves to this neoliberal tyranny. We've got to rise up against it, and it takes different forms in different places. In many ways, the major one was Latin America. Latin America in the last 10 years has undergone a really historic change, and it's largely a revolt against the neoliberal structures, so-called Washington consensus, that Latin American elites had adhered to very rigorously. They were constantly being praised for their loyalty to the great principles, but for the population it was a disaster. And about a decade ago they began to pull out of it, and for the first time in 500 years to move towards some kind of integration, towards throwing out, extricating themselves from imperial domination, and also dealing with the internal problems of societies with very potentially quite rich societies, which a lot of resources and so on, but tiny elites, Europeanized, mostly white, in a huge mass of poverty. And they're beginning to confront this. And it's showing up in international affairs. Like U.S. has lost all its military bases. This used to be what was called the backyard, and now the U.S. is almost excluded. There was a hemispheric conference about several months ago in Colombia where there were two major issues. One was admitting Cuba to the hemispheric system. The other was ending this grotesque drug war that the U.S. is running, which is tearing Latin America apart. On those two issues, the United States and Canada were totally isolated. If there's another hemispheric conference, they may not even be invited. There are now alternative structures being developed, which only include Caribbean and Latin America, not the northern white countries, because it reflects an understanding that things are badly wrong. The same thing began to happen in what are called the MENA countries, Middle East, North Africa. The uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt were in no small measure a revolt against neoliberalism. Egypt, for example, was praised by the World Bank and the IMF as just running a marvelous economy, doing everything right, except for the population. There was a famous statement by a Brazilian neo-Nazi general back around 1970 when Brazil was being praised, saying the economy is doing fine, it's just that the people aren't. And that's what Egypt and Tunisia were like. And the uprising, which had a big labor element, the militant labor movement, was substantially like that. Hasn't won. The neoliberal system is back under Muslim Brotherhood rule, but I think it's going to break. It's going to explode again because the problems are still there. People may accept obedience and deference and following orders, but not very far below the surface, they don't like it. And when people can express themselves, you see it, as, say, in the labor press in this area in the mid-19th century, which are pretty radical, though they never heard about any radical movements. So you have to block democracy. That's a real threat. And if you can, there's many ways of trying to, it's the same domestically. I mean, it's a long story, but in the United States, for example, it's a very free country by comparative standards. Roughly 70% of the population has no influence on policy at all. It's been well studied even in professional political science. Influence increases until the very top. You have people essentially get what they want. That has nothing to do with democracy. If you look at popular attitudes in the United States, they're actually mostly social democratic. Even on the right, like the Tea Party, people want more spending on education, on health care, and so on. These things have to be stopped. You can't allow that. Right now, it's very striking. All the talk in the United States in the political class, the government, the media, and so on, is about the deficit. You take a look at popular opinion. The public thinks the deficit is not a major problem. The major problem is jobs. To get jobs, you have to stimulate the economy. And interestingly, the business press agrees with them. Bloomberg Business Week, for example, says the same thing. But that's not what the financial institutions want. That's not what the wealthy want. So therefore, it doesn't enter into political discussion. Well, that's a kind of democracy. People aren't sent to the gulag and so on. But it's a very constrained democracy. It's a business-run, flawed democracy. And just as in Egypt or Brazil or anywhere else, elites certainly don't want functioning democracy. Functioning democracy would mean, for example, that stakeholders, workforce and community take over enterprises and run them themselves. They call it impossible. We say it's possible. So we're demanding the impossible. Be realistic, demand the impossible means we're going to make it real. And so yes, impossible is their term, but reality is what we want to construct. It keeps reviving because I think it's just below the surface, actually. So it keeps reviving all the time. Revived in the 1960s again, in many different ways. And every time it revives, you get these anarchist strains coming out. By now, around some of the working class areas in Ohio, around Cleveland, there's a network and a growth of worker-owned enterprises, some of them fairly substantial. The U.S. Steel, the union, has just made an arrangement with Mondragon in Spain, huge conglomerate, which is worker-owned, not worker-managed, and is pretty successful. And where it'll go, I don't know, but there's at least tentative efforts in this direction to try to reconstruct what has been a force in American history from the beginning. We want to run our own lives. We don't want bosses. We don't want to be degraded. We don't want to live in a world of deference and obedience. And we want to run enterprises ourselves. We don't need you. Why have bosses? That keeps coming out. That's one of the reasons why the business world was so terrified in the 1930s, as you can see from business publications, when the sit-down strikes began. That was really threatening. I mean, a sit-down strike, the workers don't march outside. They sit in the factory. And it's not going to take long before they decide, why don't we just run this factory? Who needs those guys? We have the skills. We can do it all ourselves. So throw out the bankers and the managers sitting off in some New York suite, and we'll run the place. And that's frightening. Things like that are happening all the time. They've started up again in the current financial crisis, and you can't. Is this anarchist? You can't really say. It's got some of the same strains, and we do have to remember that a large part of the anarchist movement was not just saying no; it was saying yes to a different kind of society which we'll organize and run. And there are efforts now to develop, fairly elaborate conceptual frameworks, theories, if you like, about how this might work, like participatory economics, Albert and Hanel and Shalom and a lot of others, big groups all over the world, in fact, here too. Whether all of this can come together in some form, it's pretty hard to say, but it might. Let's keep to the United States. A couple of years ago, as part of this financial crash, the auto companies crashed, and the government took over a substantial part of the auto industry. They were kind of quasi-nationalized under Obama. There were a couple of paths that could have been taken. One was the path that actually was taken. Reconstruct the industry so that it's more profitable and lower wages and two-tiered work systems in which new workers don't get benefits and so on, and then hand it back to the banks and the management class, and they can go on producing automobiles and so on. That was these are also incidentally big financial institutions, the General Motors and so on. So reconstruct them into something like what they were, but more efficient. That was the course that was taken. There was another possible course, which was talked about and a little bit of organizing about, but not enough to have a big impact. That was hand the whole industry over to its workforce and to the communities, so-called stakeholders. Let them have it, and let them produce things that the country really needs. The future, I think it depends on whether the things that develop, what we say spontaneously, but nothing really develops spontaneously. There's always a background of thinking, organization, struggle, and so on. But when something bursts out, like, say, the Spanish Revolution, or Occupy, or the Indignados, or Latin American breaking of neoliberal bonds, or Tahrir Square, or enterprise, worker-owned enterprises in Cleveland, all over the place. When anything breaks out, it typically has an anarchist flair to it. And it's also just in personal life, breaking down of bonds of patriarchy, let's say. Those are anarchist positions way back, not only anarchist. If you look around the world, I don't think we have to waste time on the fact that we have a major environmental crisis. It's huge, and it may be imminent. And if you look around the world, the groups that are in the forefront of trying to do something serious about it are indigenous communities. They may call themselves Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations, whatever they call themselves. These are the ones who are pressing the hardest to pay attention to what they even call the rights of nature, which is an old anarchist idea, incidentally, though I never heard of it. Rights of nature have to be protected. I mean, in countries with a large indigenous population, like Bolivia and Ecuador, it's actually in the laws now. You have to respect the rights of nature. These are people who are struggling against mining all over the world. Big battles all over the world, India, Australia, Colombia, against mining operations which are just destroying nature and destroying our lives at the same time. And that's kind of ecological anarchism from a different point of view. And that's a kind of sensibility that the industrial world is going to have to internalize, or we're going to be really facing doom seriously.